In 1989, author and researcher Robert Bauval published the idea that the Giza Pyramids had been purposefully aligned with Orion's belt. Intriguing as that idea is in itself, the theory evolved to suggest that the alignment had been most accurate in or around 10,000 BCE, around 7,500 years earlier than the traditional date range given for the construction of the pyramids. So of course this became known as a rather controversial and fringe theory, which was picked up and built on by other researchers and authors over the years. Rebuttals have also been written. In this video, I'm going to present an overview of this theory, the evidence that supports it and the evidence that refutes it. This is a balanced treatment of the subject. Pitchforks will not be tolerated. Only comment if you want to have a proper discussion of the evidence. Some of my treasured audience members are knowledgeable on this sort of thing, so we can have a really good conversation around it. Let's go. In 1989, in the journal Discussions in Egyptology, Robert Bauval published an article entitled "A Master Plan for the Three Pyramids of Giza Based on the Configuration of the Three Stars of the Belt of Orion." I'll do my best to summarize the key points here. It starts by discussing the pyramid texts, which focus on the transfiguration of deceased pharaohs into stars, the constellation of Orion playing an important role in this mythology. Orion represented the god Osiris, and in the Osiris cult, which developed at some point during the Old Kingdom, the pharaoh was associated with Osiris after death. Osiris represented rebirth and resurrection. In 2600 BCE, the constellation of Orion rose on midsummer at dawn, which coincided with the Nile flood, an incredibly significant time for the ancient Egyptians due to irrigation and agriculture. A section of the pyramid text reads, "Behold, he has come as Orion. Behold, Osiris has come as Orion, O king. The sky conceives you with Orion. The dawn light bears you with Orion. You will regularly ascend with Orion from the eastern region of the sky. You will regularly descend with Orion into the western region of the sky. O king, you are this great star, the companion of Orion, who traverses the sky with Orion, who navigates the netherworld with Osiris. You ascend from the east of the sky, being renewed in your due season and rejuvenated in your due time. Live, be alive, be young beside your father, beside Orion in the sky." Bauval discusses how the Egyptians referred to Orion as Sar, who was represented in art as a male figure carrying an ankh and a staff with three stars above his head. So the idea that the ancient Egyptians would have mapped the sky onto the ground is not a crazy one when we understand their mythology. Simply put, the sky played an important role in their religion. Orion's belt consists of three stars: Zeta Orionis, also known as Alnitak, Epsilon Orionis, also known as Alnilam, and Delta Orionis, also known as Mintaka, which form a rough line, but with the third one deviating slightly from the other two. As can be seen from the layout of the Giza Pyramids, that of Khufu and Khafra are aligned, and Menkora is offset slightly. Bauval writes that the three stars are aligned in a southwesterly direction as they cross the meridian, just as the three pyramids are aligned in a southwesterly direction and are each orientated meridionally. He also mentions how Delta Orionis is less bright than the other two stars of Orion's belt, and that this appears to be reflected in the smaller size of the Menkora pyramid. In the 1980s, astrophysicist Virginia Trimble and the late Egyptologist Alexander Badawi noted that the southern shaft in Khufu's pyramid seemed to be purposefully aligned with Zeta Orionis. So, since the ancient Egyptians were preoccupied with Orion in their religion, as well as potentially in aspects of their construction, Bauval sees the layout of the pyramids as another way in which they express this connection to the constellation. Bauval sees these correlations as part of a construction master plan to represent the sky, the destination of the deceased, on Earth around the Giza Plateau. Furthermore, if such a master plan did exist, then it was probably inspired by natural features, such as the Nile, which the ancient Egyptians may have seen as the earthly counterpart to the Milky Way. Construction of the Giza Pyramids is traditionally thought to have begun around 2600 BCE. Since that time, the position of Orion's belt as seen against the horizon has changed due to precession of the equinoxes. I imagine most of you watch this channel because you're interested in the ancient past and therefore are probably quite familiar with precession of the equinoxes and archaeoastronomy. but if not, here's a quick overview which can be skipped using the chapter buttons. Precession of the equinoxes, also called axial precession, refers to the way the Earth's axis of rotation shifts slowly over a 26,000-year cycle. This means that the fixed stars appear to change position due to the movement of the equinoxes westward along the ecliptic. The ancient Greeks knew about this, but there's an increasing amount of evidence that knowledge of axial precession goes back into prehistory. According to Bauval, the position of Orion's belt against the horizon changed between 2600 BCE and 1987 by the following. The right ascension increased by 3 hours, so around 45 degrees, and the declination south of the celestial equator decreased by about 14 degrees. This means that the southern shaft of Khufu's pyramid would have been better aligned with Zeta Orionis in 2600 BCE. So if traditional dating for the pyramids is stuck to, there's even more evidence for a preoccupation with Orion in construction. Bauval elaborated on his theory in later works with other authors. In his book, The Orion Mystery, co-authored with Adrian Gilbert, Bauval's remarkable idea emerged that Orion's belt would have mapped most accurately onto the Giza pyramids around 10,400 BCE. He then collaborated with Graham Hancock for the book Keeper of Genesis, titled The Message of the Sphinx in the US, where they went into more detail on this theory, essentially saying that in 10,500 BCE, as viewed from the Giza Plateau, Orion's belt was positioned due south on the meridian just before sunrise on the spring equinox. So if the Giza pyramids were meant to map Orion's belt on the ground, then they are more likely to have been built in this much earlier epoch, making them considerably older than traditionally thought by archaeologists. Bauval and Hancock also put forward the idea that the east-facing Sphinx is meant to represent the constellation of Leo, and also dates back to 10,000 BC when the sun would have risen in Leo on the spring equinox. This expands the idea of a master plan and pinpoints a specific time in history. They also argued that erosion patterns around the Sphinx point to it having been built during wetter times, which would match the weather during the Ice Age and the date of 10,500 BCE. This tantalizing date is also when the Younger Dryas period began, the time when the Earth cooled suddenly even though it had been gradually warming for several thousand years. As you probably know, there are a number of hypotheses as to why the Younger Dryas period happened, not least of which is the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, which suggests that a comet initiated this strange period of cooling. It had a huge effect on flora and fauna, so the idea is that there might be a connection between these megalithic building projects and the Younger Dryas period, although I imagine at a time difficult for survival, especially if initiated by a catastrophe, megaliths couldn't have been a priority. Incidentally, though, the construction of Göbekli Tepe and other sites in Turkey coincides quite neatly with the end of the Younger Dryas period. One of the main opponents of both the Orion Correlation Theory and the much older date of the Giza Pyramids is astronomer Dr. Edwin Krupp. In 1997, he wrote the article Pyramid Marketing Schemes in the magazine Sky and Telescope to give his thoughts on the subject. In it, he said that the pyramids would need to be turned upside down, with Menkora moving to the north to accurately reflect Orion's belt. This is because astronomers see the sky as a dome, and the highest star in Orion's belt, Mintaka, is considered as north of the other two. Mintaka is offset slightly from the other two stars, and it is Mintaka that is thought to be depicted by the Menkora pyramid on the ground, the most southerly pyramid of the three. Bauval and Hancock issued a rebuttal to this point by arguing that the ancient Egyptians would have created a ground plan of Orion's belt as they saw it, rather than considering north as up, since this is a modern convention. Several astronomers are alleged to have supported this viewpoint. The whole subject got all the more controversial when the BBC made a documentary called Atlantis Reborn, where the Orion Correlation Theory was discussed, including the upside-down argument against it, but not the rebuttal of this particular point. Bauval and Hancock complained to the Broadcasting Standards Commission, and a revised edition of the documentary called Atlantis Reborn Again was brought out, where a fuller argument was presented. In 2001, Dr. Krupp returned to the subject once again in his article The Sphinx Blinks, in another edition of Sky and Telescope magazine. He discussed how the east-facing Sphinx represents Horamakhet, the Horus of the horizon, which was the personification of the rising sun to the ancient Egyptians. They did not see the Sphinx as representing the constellation of Leo. In fact, the traditional zodiac, where Leo is represented by a lion, didn't exist in Egypt during the Pyramid Age. It originated in Mesopotamia before being passed on to the ancient Greeks. The beautiful constellations that were carved onto the ceiling of the Dendera temple date to the Ptolemaic period, so were brought to Egypt by a Macedonian Greek dynasty. In the New Kingdom, a lion constellation did exist as a carving amongst celestial layouts on the ceilings of tombs. However, it didn't represent Leo, but rather it represented stars of the Big Dipper. In fact, it also appears in the Dendera zodiac as an additional lion to Leo close to the bull's leg of the Big Dipper. Personally, I don't think that Orion Correlation Theory is so strange. In fact, there are other ancient sites where it's possible that Orion's belt was encoded into a ground plan. For example, the Thornborough Henges in England, Teotihuacan in Mexico. And why not? The ancients would have spent a lot more time outside than we do, and I'm sure the night sky was just as fascinating to them as it is to us. We might not know much about beliefs in prehistory before written languages existed, but we do know that later cultures, such as the ancient Egyptians, were very preoccupied with the cosmos because they wrote that they were. Actually, when we look at prehistory, as I mentioned in a video a few weeks ago, there's a lot of evidence to support the idea that Greek myths have Paleolithic origins, and some of these myths were associated with the stars. I don't think that the Sphinx necessarily represents the constellation of Leo, but it is an enigmatic monument. There is a lot more mystery associated with the Giza Pyramids and the Sphinx than there is with later Egyptian monuments. The problem with assigning an older date for these structures is that there just isn't enough evidence to support it. Astronomical alignments and erosion are not concrete enough proof for such a vastly ancient date. We aren't looking at a few hundred years here, but thousands of years. However, I am open to the idea that other evidence might be found or may already exist that can lend weight to this hypothesis. Alternatively, there's the idea that construction of the Giza Pyramids and the Sphinx didn't take place in 10,500 BCE, but when they were built much later, they were designed to commemorate this more ancient date. In my opinion, the ancients' interest in the sky went beyond solstices and equinoxes, and it's also entirely possible that the zodiac, as the Sumerians and ancient Greeks knew it, was rooted in the more ancient past. The thing I've always wondered about, though, is whenever it was invented, why did constellations become animals in the first place? It's one heck of a stretch of the imagination. I just don't see it. Anyway, that's it. I hope you enjoyed this video. It's not an easy subject to summarize, so do take a look at the sources I've listed below. Don't forget to hit the like button and make an offering to the algorithm gods via the comment section. Thank you to my patrons and channel members, and I'll catch up with you next time.